So we're now coming to ERIAC, the European Roma Institute for Art and Culture, and let's go into the Katitzi show. Do you know about Pippi Longstocking?
Yes, of course, she's one of my favorite childhood characters.
Very good, because Katitzi is a more modern version of Pippi Longstocking, but somebody who is grounded more in reality than Pippi. This exhibition deals with the literary character, which is Katitzi, and she's the lead figure in a dozen children's books that were written between 1969 and 1982 by Katarina Taikon. She has been called the Martin Luther King of Sweden, and she was an activist, a writer, Roma origin, who grew up and lived her whole life in Sweden. Okay. And we have Katitzi, the child bride, Katitzi Z1234, Katitzi in Stockholm, and Katitzi on the run. The books really reflect her childhood, her youth.
The coming of age also.
Yeah, the coming of age, exactly. Yeah. So the exhibition focuses on the literary character through the books, through the original illustrations, through other expressions of the popularity of Katitzi, because it became a bestseller in Sweden. When the first book appeared in 1969, it was very much the result of Katarina Taikon being frustrated with her activist work. She had lobbied hard for the rights of the Roma together with her sister, Rosa, whose name is mentioned here, and some other friends, in relation to Swedish authorities, but she felt that she couldn't get as far as she wanted, and she thought that talking to children about the Roma situation would be a way forward, and that's why she started to write these books. And here we have some of the original covers of the books that appeared one per year, which were made by Björn Hedlund, and he's key in telling the story about Katitzi, because it's not just a text about this girl, it is also the images. He helped form the literary character.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Of course, probably, the Katarina Taikon has the text, but of course, that she needed to have really good visual partner to be able to create that imaginative world of Katitzi.
Exactly. Yeah, I got the first Katitzi book on my 6th birthday. It accompanied me in my childhood, and I moved a few times. I always kept it. So in the first book, we meet Katitzi when she is at an orphanage. She is eating breakfast, she's swimming with her friends, but it happens to be an involuntary swim. Another girl in the orphanage called Ruttan, she pushes Katitzi into the water and she cannot swim, so she's terrified. But she also has really good friends, and she befriends as well one of the caretakers, a lady. And one day, all of a sudden, a foreign man appears, somebody she doesn't recognize with a big mustache, and says, "I'm your father, you should come with us, with me, back to the family." And here we see Katitzi waving to her friends at the orphanage when she finally goes with him to stay with the family. Her mother passed away when she was only a couple of years old, and her father remarried, so there was a stepmother. And part of the family was a younger sibling, maybe two even, and then her older siblings, two sisters and a brother. And they earn money by the father owning a Tivoli, or a small mobile amusement park, and they traveled the country. In those days in Sweden, the Roma were not allowed to stay longer than 3 months in one place.
So this was by law regulation?
Yes.
Okay.
And they were chased away, which meant that schooling was virtually impossible. And we can maybe take a look at this one, because here we can see her sister Rosa again. She performed at the Tivoli. She was the drummer, And actually on YouTube you can look up Rosa Taikon and you will see one of these clips when she's actually playing the drums. She saves her little brother from a fire in the carriage in which they're living. If we look at these illustrations by Björn Hedlund, we can tell that it's the late 60s. It's a slight psychedelic language. Posters from the 60s come across that kind of feeling. This, by the way, is the stepmother who was not particularly nice to Katitzi. And I grew up with these books, like many people in Sweden who were kids in those days. And for me, this stepmother became like the incarnation of malevolence, somebody who really is not nice. And every year, almost, there was a new book. So you could follow Katitzi, and for each book, the character is also growing older, like yourself. Yeah, yeah. So it was like befriending somebody, I would say.
This growing up is a really, I think, gives a really very powerful sense of identification to the reader or like to the public.
The English translation, it was Tensta Konsthallen and myself who really pushed this, because if this is not being translated, the material will not circulate. So this is the very first one. Maybe on the cover you can get a sense of this 60s
yes, definitely,
style.
Definitely.
Generous in terms of the amount of illustrations, building the foundation of the character. And then you can see the earlier ones. Katitzi is running away, Katitzi in the snake pit. Björn Hedlund continued to make the covers and the illustrations for the subsequent books, but he changed styles, as you can see. It became a little bit more realistic and almost rustic, you could say.
This is more like, I mean, this looks certainly more folkloric, these like two than the first edition, for sure, yeah.
And pretty soon it was translated. First into the other Nordic languages, Katitzi ja Vinki, which is in Finnish. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the books were translated into Eastern European languages. So we can see some of them here. And eventually, it also became a comic, but it was so popular. It sold in so many copies, and it was borrowed so many times at libraries that some people thought that this could even work as a comic book. I think it's fascinating to think about that. They saw the potential in material like this, which today I don't think many publishers of that kind would pick up on.
Is it again like kind of the same as Björn Langhammer, like kind of continuing, or like is it another?
Yes, in this case it's him. But with these books, which are like a mix between a comic book and the story itself, it is another illustrator. So the story is shortened, where everything is a bit more sweet.
Yeah, it's of course a very different tone than the first edition.
And interestingly, the last one, which is when she has come of age, really, it's a photograph of Katarina Taikon on the cover. The first English edition, or translation and edition, is actually part of this book. It's a double publication with the first Katitzi book in English, plus the first biography on Katarina Taikon by Laven Moktadi. She did plenty of research, and she managed to do it also when Rosa Taikon, the sister of Katarina, was still alive. Rosa was a well-known silversmith and a co-fighter in terms of the Roma cause in Sweden. And here is also the famous photograph of Katarina Taikon and Martin Luther King. They did meet in Stockholm when Martin Luther King was on his way to Oslo to get the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh, wow.
I think it's important to think about Katitzi when the books were published. Concern with what we would call qualitative children's culture was entirely different. And it affected us. So here we have this children's magazine that I mentioned, Kamratposten, where it was first published as a serial. Here I want to point out the fact that it's Katitzi, certainly, that's the name of the comic book, but there is another comic embedded into it called Linus och Lotta, typical traditional Swedish names. So the publisher apparently felt that it was important to include something that could be perceived as more classically Swedish, as if it was not appropriate to only have Katitzi. And here you have a more normative kind of situation with the two blonde kids. The film eventually became a DVD as well, and an LP. And this LP was issued by one of the most populist record label owners in Sweden, who just did, super kitschy stuff. But he somehow figured that this could be commercially valid. But on one of the covers, it says that this is a real Swedish comic, which should be read in terms of the discussion around US cultural imperialism. In those days, in the 70s, US-American children's products were not particularly welcome in Sweden. So I saw one Disney film when I grew up, that was it. So it was important to have a stance somehow against that.
Wow, those were the times, eh?
Yeah, exactly.
As if now we have a chance. Yeah. I mean, I still get a little bit end of it, but I think right now there's no way out. That's amazing. I mean, it kind of certainly shows the importance of the what kind of ideas are kind of put there in that the qualitative children's education, like as you said, and what kind of language is being then conveyed, and how that it helps of a different imagination of a world.
I can easily say I would not be the same human being had I not encountered Katitzi. It was very important for me. For me also, it means a lot to have the show here at ERIAC. And I'm grateful that they generously offered the space and that we could reshape it, paint the walls, put in a carpet. The Katitzi books, the whole series, is a treasure. It's an important Roma literary legacy, and it's an essential part of children's literature. Here you have, in moving image, examples of the popularity of the character. On the right-hand side is a television series, which eventually also was shown in cinemas.
Something I wanted to ask, like if it turned into an animation also further, or a TV series, like some more popular now.
This TV series / film with very well-known actors. Monica Zetterlund and Janne Loffe Karlsson, really big stars at the time in Sweden. And on the left-hand side, documentation of a couple of performances, different stagings of a play that came about in the 2000s. Again, based on the first book. And different theater groups have taken it on, and it's also been touring across the country. And it's interesting to think about this revival. It's when the people who used to read Katitzi in the 70s and 80s had children themselves, that there is this revival, because they are obviously, like myself, wanting their children to
also read the books.
To also read the books and to take part of this incredible story.
So here we have two posters of the Katitzi play, which was dramatized by Emma Broström, and Emma appears here as well on this poster, directed by Kajsa Isaksson. And if we look at the representation of Katitzi here, she's like a superhero, approaching with a lot of energy, with the power. And this is in many ways what she is in the stories. She experiences extreme hardship, but she somehow survives, and we encounter her in this story, which is full of music. It's a bit like a musical as well, and how she's also maturing through her experience. The first time it was staged was at Folkteatern, the People's Theatre in Gothenburg, with Lars-Erik Brosner as the director, and the second staging was by Riksteatern, the National Theatre, which is a traveling theatre. So through that, it was actually played in many parts of the country. So to have a role model like Katarina Taikon, her life was not entirely sunny, as we understand from her childhood, but also later on in life. You are forced to think about the conditions of the Roma in Sweden, of that time, but also further back in history. The presence of the Roma in Sweden goes back to the 16th century, according to the documents that are still there. But they have most of the time been heavily discriminated against. And this continued throughout the 20th century, to the point that Sweden would not allow Roma survivors from the Holocaust any easy access to the country. Shortly after the biography by Laven came out, the same publisher, Natur och Kultur, decided to republish the first two Katitzi books in Swedish. They had been out of print for ages before that. Okay. So that's another reason why the revival of Katitzi is happening right now. An article in one of the main daily newspapers when the first Katitzi book came out. Actually, it was published as chapters, as a serial in a children's magazine, Kamratposten. And when the comic book appeared, there was always at the end something about the life of the Roma. And Katarina also had a column where children could write her about anything with questions, etc. So she got loads and loads of letters, including some drawings. And here somebody is describing Katitzi, her bigger sister Lena, and Papa Taikon, the father.
So this is the moment that she's leaving the orphanage?
No, she is not allowed to go to school.
She's not a director.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Katarina Taikon was a public figure, you could say. And she had a big impact on the perception of the Roma in Sweden, as well as the concrete situation in terms of housing, the possibility of getting apartments, etc.
Like around the time when also the book came out, you said that was a bestseller and a lot of kids grew up with it. Were there some also reactionary gestures in Sweden, for that depiction, or a kind of a more nationalist kind, or more against the nomadic existence in a way?
Not that I know of in the 70s, but in the 50s, one of the most cherished writers, Ivar Lo-Johansson, who was a workers' writer and actually a great writer, he upheld the romantic idea that the Roma should continue their nomadic lifestyle, which is of course interesting in terms of not forcing anybody into any other lifestyle, but it was such hard conditions for many of the Roma in the northern climate, living in tents, and children
actually freezing to death still in those days, in the 50s, because they did not have proper housing. Yeah. So Katarina Taikon and Rosa Taikon, they were very critical of his romantic ideas and propagated for proper housing against the so-called camps, because there were areas where many of the Roma gathered and had their caravans and tents, etc.
The kind of world that we are passing through right now, it is really very important to remember those figures, and like how actually certain different approaches are kind of were there towards like the other in the societies, and how these projects were successful, and it really helped generations to build a different sense of being for themselves, and also in terms of understanding oneself as a different citizen. It is really very important like to go over these histories, because of course nomadic existences I think has been considered as a danger to the normative order of the societies in Europe like for a really long time. And it is also like used also as a fuel for I would say like right-wing nationalistic discourses also, because they can be easily identified as like the outsider enemy, because they refuse to settle in that order that the capitalist system asks them to, and they have a very different other relationship to the world than the normative education also like kind of sets and demands. And I think like majority of the people don't know like how these actually regulations, as you said, like kind of continued until very recently. Yeah. These are very present still, and these are not really like clearly discussed, while of course at the same time there are many different gestures and many important like kind of, let's say, cultural collaborations are happening more. Also in Venice Biennial there was also the Roma pavilion at some stage, I remember. I think like art is certainly one of the most important mediums like to also dissipate and like to circulate the untouched or like kind of pushed back, elbowed back information, which is part of like this certain reactions that kind of we have, why certain people are so confident in defending their bigotry, I would say, because they feel secure, because there are certain protections also by the state systems. Such regulations against the people, also Roma, the people of the world, they are the people of Europe. As well, maybe also like the whole Europe that they own in a certain way,
more than anybody else.
More than anybody else, and like this somehow also I think all of these background like continuous regulations and prejudices also now appear in the border, in the idea of border and sovereignty and like kind of nationalism, kind of coming to certain savior of like the state structures right now in Europe, rather than seeing themselves in a more like a kind of a collaborative alliance.